The Untold Truth of Phyllis Hyman, the celebrity who was underrated. Hook. What if everything you knew about your past was a lie? Phyllis Hyman's life is about to unravel in ways she never expected. From the shadows of mystery to the terrifying truth, she'll discover powers she never knew she had, and a destiny she can't escape. Stay with us till the end, because the real story begins now. Phyllis Hyman stood backstage, the hum of the crowd reaching her ears. She could feel her heart thudding in her chest. The lights, the tension. It was all too familiar, but tonight felt different. Her reflection in the mirror looked foreign. The woman staring back at her had the same fierce eyes, the same striking features. Yet something was missing. Something was wrong. Phyllis ran her fingers through her hair. She felt the warmth of her hand, but the chill in her spine was unmistakable. The crowd outside was waiting. They screamed her name. The anticipation was heavy, thick like smoke. She could almost taste it. The excitement, the fear, the weight of her own expectations. "Phyllis," a voice said softly behind her. It was her manager. He didn't say much. His eyes were tight, as if hiding something. She turned, raising an eyebrow. "What is it?" He didn't respond immediately. His gaze flickered to the door, and then back to her. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice cracked. She looked at him for a moment, searching for the truth beneath his facade. Something felt off. She could feel it in her gut. The murmurs grew louder. The crowd's chants grew more urgent, a frantic pulse in the air. Her manager turned away, glancing at the stage crew. Phyllis didn't move. She stayed still, her hand gripping the edge of the mirror. Suddenly, the air seemed thicker. Her vision blurred slightly. Her pulse raced faster, a storm building inside her. And then she heard it, the muffled sound of footsteps. Someone was in the room. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned around. Nothing. The door was locked. Her heart hammered harder. She could hear her own heartbeat, the sound deafening. The door creaked open. A shadow crossed the threshold. She blinked. The shadow was gone, but the tension remained. She turned back to the mirror, only to see the reflection change. A figure stood beside her, a figure she didn't recognize. "Who are you?" Phyllis whispered, but the words seemed to get lost in the silence. The figure didn't respond. The door slammed shut behind her. Everything went black. A chill ran down her spine. The world around her felt distant, hollow. And then she heard the whispers. The whispers were faint at first, like a breeze brushing against her ear. Then they grew louder, closer. Phyllis turned, her head snapping around to face the emptiness. There was no one, just the heavy darkness that seemed to swallow her whole. Her pulse quickened, her chest tightened. She stepped back, her feet stumbling against the cold floor. The shadows moved. They stretched, contorted. Something wasn't right. She reached for the light switch, but her hand froze before it could touch it. A coldness washed over her. A presence, something sinister, filled the air. Then silence, the kind of silence that suffocated, that made every breath feel like an effort. A sudden chill crept up her spine, and she shuddered, almost as if someone was standing too close. The room felt smaller, the walls too tight. Her thoughts raced. What was happening? Who was in the room with her? The door, the one that had just slammed shut, creaked again. It was as though it wanted her to look. Phyllis didn't want to, but she had to. With a slow, deliberate movement, she turned her head toward it. The door was cracked open. Her body tensed. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. And then there was a figure in the doorway. A figure that wasn't there moments ago. A woman. Her face was obscured by shadows, but Phyllis could feel her gaze, cold and penetrating. The air seemed to freeze. "Who are you?" Phyllis whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't speak, but she stepped closer, closer. Each step was deliberate, slow, almost haunting. Phyllis could feel the weight of her presence, heavy as it pressed in on her. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The figure's too close now, too close to ignore. The woman reached out, her hand hovering in the air. It was then that Phyllis saw it. The glint of something in her hand. A knife. A flash of steel in the dim light. The air was thick with tension. Phyllis felt her skin prickle, her heart pounding in her chest. A sharp breath escaped her lips. And then the woman smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. It wasn't a smile at all. It was a warning. Phyllis froze. The woman's smile twisted into something darker, more sinister. Her eyes locked onto Phyllis, cold and hollow. The knife gleamed in the dim light, the reflection of it dancing in Phyllis's eyes. Her body screamed to move, to escape, but she was paralyzed, rooted in place by the weight of that stare. The woman took another step forward, closer, too close. Phyllis could smell her, the scent of cold metal and something sharp, like iron. Her pulse pounded in her ears, louder than the whispers that still lingered in the room. Then the figure spoke, but her voice wasn't what Phyllis had expected. It was low, hushed. "You shouldn't have come." Phyllis's heart stopped. Her breath hitched. Every instinct in her told her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The room was too small, too cramped, the walls pressing in on her. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The woman's hand raised, the knife glinting in the half-light, catching the reflection of Phyllis's wide, horrified eyes. A sudden bang echoed in the hallway outside. Someone had entered the building, but the woman didn't move. She just kept staring at Phyllis, like a predator locking onto its prey. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. The woman's eyes flickered for a moment, and that was all Phyllis needed. She lunged, pushing the woman aside, her body fueled by raw adrenaline. The knife slashed at her sleeve as she bolted past. She didn't stop to look back. She couldn't. The hallway stretched ahead, empty, silent. Her breath was ragged, echoing off the walls as she ran. Her mind raced. Who was she? What did she want? A door at the end of the hallway loomed. Phyllis reached for it, her fingers trembling as they grasped the handle. It creaked open, but before she could step through, a hand grabbed her arm, tight. Phyllis spun around, her body crashing into the figure. The woman stood there again, her eyes darker, colder. "You're not leaving," she whispered. And then everything went black. Phyllis's world spun. Her head slammed into the cold floor. Darkness swallowed her whole. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her chest was crushed under the weight of something unseen, her body frozen, her limbs heavy. She blinked, trying to focus, but the room was spinning. Her eyes shot open in panic. The woman was standing above her, watching. Her lips curled into that same twisted, empty smile. Phyllis tried to move, but her body felt like it was made of stone. Her throat tightened. She could barely swallow. The woman kneeled beside her. Her fingers pressed into Phyllis's skin, cold and unfeeling. Phyllis struggled, gasping for air, but every movement was slow, sluggish. It felt like a dream or a nightmare. But the pain, the rawness, it was real. The woman leaned closer, her face inches from Phyllis's, her eyes so dark they were almost black. "You're a star," the woman whispered, her breath hot against Phyllis's face. "But stars burn out, don't they?" Phyllis couldn't respond. She couldn't even speak. The woman's hand traced down Phyllis's neck, the cold fingers leaving a trail of icy fire behind. Phyllis's heart pounded harder, desperate for a way out. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere far away. Phyllis's eyes widened. Footsteps. Heavy, urgent. Someone was coming. The woman's gaze flickered toward the noise. Phyllis seized the moment. Her body surged with what little strength she had left. Her legs kicked out, catching the woman off guard. The woman stumbled back. Phyllis scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking. The door. She had to get to the door. But as she moved, the woman recovered quickly. "No, you won't escape." Her voice was low, a warning. Phyllis reached the door, her fingers closing around the cold handle. But before she could pull it open, the woman lunged. A sharp pain sliced through her side. She gasped, her body jerking in shock. The knife. It was in her side. The pain seared, burning through her flesh. Phyllis cried out, but the sound was weak, almost silent. The woman yanked the knife out. Phyllis crumpled to the ground, her breath shallow. She could feel the life draining from her. The world around her began to blur. Her vision swirled in and out of focus. Footsteps. Closer. The door swung open. A man burst into the room, his face twisted in alarm. It was her manager, but it was too late. Phyllis's vision faded to black. The last thing she saw was the woman, standing in the shadows, watching. Waiting, the darkness swallowed her whole. There was nothing, no sound, no light, just a cold, empty void. Then a voice, a faint whisper. "Phyllis." It was distant, soft, like a memory. Her eyes fluttered open, but everything was blurry. She couldn't focus. The pain was still there, a dull, pulsing throb in her side. She tried to move, but her body refused to cooperate. The air felt heavy, as though it was pressing down on her. Her breath came in shallow gasps. "Phyllis, stay with me," the voice said again, clearer now. It was her manager. His face was over her, his eyes wide with fear. Phyllis tried to speak, but no words came. Her throat was dry, raw. The room around her was spinning. She was lying on a cold, hard surface. She couldn't tell where. She reached out, her hand trembling, and grabbed his arm. "Phyllis, we need to get you out of here," he said urgently, his voice strained. "We have to go now." Phyllis couldn't make sense of it. Everything felt wrong. Her chest tightened. She could feel the weight of something pressing on her mind, like a dark cloud. The memories came flooding back. The woman, the knife, the pain. But they were fractured, slipping through her thoughts like water through her fingers. Her manager lifted her gently, his grip steady. He whispered, "You're safe now." But the voice in her mind, the woman's voice, it wouldn't leave. "You're not safe," it hissed. Her manager moved quickly, but she could feel something lurking, something waiting. The air was thick with tension, heavy with dread. Phyllis tried to sit up, to fight through the fog in her mind. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just hold on, Phyllis." "We're almost there," her manager replied, his voice tight with urgency. But Phyllis could feel it. She could feel the eyes on her, watching, waiting. They passed through the narrow hallway, his grip never loosening, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty, dark corridor. Suddenly they stopped. Phyllis looked up, her mind spinning. The hallway stretched out in front of them, dark and endless. And then there it was, the woman, standing at the end of the hallway. Her dark eyes locked onto Phyllis's, her cold smile spreading across her face. Phyllis's heart skipped a beat. The woman didn't move, but her presence filled the space, suffocating, overwhelming. "Run!" her manager shouted. Phyllis tried to, but her legs wouldn't move. The woman stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Her voice sliced through the silence. "You can't escape." Phyllis's breath caught in her throat. And then she heard something that made her blood run cold. A soft, haunting laugh from behind her. It wasn't her manager. The woman. Had someone else. Phyllis's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head slowly, a wave of dread crashing over her. Behind her, standing in the shadows, was another figure, the silhouette of a man, tall, looming. His face was hidden, but the outline of his form was unmistakable. He stepped forward, his presence heavy like a storm cloud. Phyllis tried to speak, but her throat felt too tight. The woman's cold eyes remained locked on hers, unblinking. The man moved closer, his footsteps deliberate, measured. Her manager pulled her back, urgency flooding his voice. "No, we need to go now." But Phyllis couldn't look away. Something about the man felt wrong. Something familiar, yet terrifying. He was getting closer. Too close. Her manager tugged harder at her arm. "Phyllis, listen to me. We have to move." But Phyllis didn't move. Her feet felt like they were rooted to the floor, as though an invisible force held her in place. The woman's voice cut through the tension. "It's too late. She's already ours." Phyllis's breath caught. The words echoed in her mind, churning, gnawing at her. Her manager's grip tightened. He pulled her again, harder, and then the man spoke. His voice was deep, low. "You don't understand, do you?" Phyllis's blood ran cold. She turned to face him, her breath shallow. The man stepped forward, his face slowly becoming clearer, but even as he did, a sick realization settled in her stomach. It was him, the man she thought was dead, the man who had disappeared years ago, her ex-husband, the one who had vanished without a trace, the one who was never found. She stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of it. The figure in front of her, this man was him. But how? You were dead," Phyllis whispered, her voice barely audible. Her ex-husband smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was sharp, hollow, as if every part of him was lost, consumed. "No," he said, his voice drenched in an eerie calmness. "I've been waiting for you." Phyllis recoiled, the world around her spinning faster. Her manager stepped forward, trying to block her view. "You're not him. You can't be." But the man laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the empty hall. Phyllis couldn't breathe. Her ex-husband reached out, his hand extending toward her. "You're mine again, Phyllis," he said softly, his voice like a dark promise. "And this time, you're never leaving." Suddenly, everything crashed together. The woman, the man, the memories flooding her mind. It all twisted into one nightmare. One long, inescapable nightmare. And then, just as quickly as it began, everything went still. Too still. Phyllis's breath was ragged, her chest tight. Her heart pounded in her ears. She could hear her manager calling to her, but his voice sounded distant, fading, as if the room itself was closing in. The darkness began to creep back, and with it the cold that had never left. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The coldness wrapped itself tighter around her. Phyllis's vision blurred once more, the world fading in and out of focus. Her ex-husband's figure loomed closer, his presence suffocating. The woman beside him, dark, silent, watchful, remained motionless, her eyes burning into Phyllis's soul. "Don't listen to him," her manager urged, his voice shaky but desperate. "We can get out of here. Phyllis, we need to move now." But Phyllis couldn't. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the man she thought she had buried. The man who had ruined everything. The man who had disappeared, leaving only questions behind. His face twisted into that same chilling smile. "I never left, Phyllis," he said softly, his voice like ice scraping against her skin. "I've been waiting for this moment, for you to come back to me." The words hit her like a slap. Memories flooded back, dark, twisted memories of their past, of betrayal, of control, of the man who once owned her in ways that left scars she thought she could escape. But now he was here, and the nightmare wasn't over. "Don't listen to him!" her manager shouted again, pulling at her arm, but she didn't respond. Phyllis's heart hammered in her chest. It was as if her body had stopped functioning, stuck in place by the weight of this haunting truth. Her ex-husband reached out, his fingers long and cold. "You belong to me," he whispered, stepping even closer. The woman beside him took a step forward, a silent sentinel to the nightmare unfolding. The coldness in the room intensified, and Phyllis could feel the sharp edge of panic clawing at her chest. Her manager's face twisted in confusion, his eyes darting between Phyllis and the figures in front of them. "What is this? What's happening?" The man's lips curled, his voice turning darker. "You don't understand, do you?" Phyllis's mind screamed for her to run, to do something, anything, to escape this suffocating nightmare. But her body refused to move. Her limbs were frozen in place. The world felt like it was closing in on her. The air was thick, charged with an overwhelming sense of doom. The woman's cold gaze flickered toward the manager, then back to Phyllis. She didn't speak, but her presence was heavy. Phyllis's head spun. The walls seemed to close in. She could feel the walls tightening, squeezing her chest. The man and woman were closer now, just a few steps away, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "No," Phyllis breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I won't." Her ex-husband's smile only grew wider. "You never had a choice, Phyllis. It was always meant to be this way." Suddenly, there was a sharp noise, a thud, followed by a loud crash. Phyllis snapped her head toward the sound. The door at the far end of the hallway, the exit, burst open. Two figures rushed in, their silhouettes barely visible against the dim light. The woman's eyes flickered to the newcomers, her expression hardening. Her ex-husband's face darkened, his smile fading. "Get out of the way," one of the newcomers said, his voice firm. Phyllis's heart leaped in her chest. Her pulse quickened. Her manager grabbed her arm again, urgency flooding his voice. "We have to go now. Run." Phyllis didn't need to be told twice. Her body finally responded. She yanked away from him, stumbling toward the door, toward the light. The figures, two men, moved forward quickly, blocking the woman and her ex-husband's path. The tension in the air was electric, crackling with impending violence. But Phyllis didn't wait to see what happened next. She ran. Her feet pounded the floor, her breath ragged as she tore through the hallway, the light ahead growing brighter with every step. Her heart thudded in her chest. And then she burst into the fresh air. It felt like freedom. She didn't stop. She couldn't. But in the distance, through the haze, she could see the shadows of the man and the woman standing in the doorway, watching, waiting. And the darkness, that cold, relentless darkness, was always just behind her. Phyllis's feet hit the pavement outside with a force that made her legs feel like jelly. But she didn't stop running. She couldn't. Every breath she took felt like it was being ripped from her lungs, the cold night air biting at her skin. But the chill in her bones was nothing compared to the terror that was closing in behind her. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street behind her was empty. No sign of her ex-husband. No sign of the woman. Yet, the weight of their presence still pressed on her chest, like a shadow that refused to let go. "Phyllis!" her manager shouted, running to catch up. She didn't slow down. The fear was like a fire, burning in her veins. The memory of their cold eyes, their twisted smiles, the knife. It was all still so fresh. "You need to stop," he cried, but his voice barely registered in her ears. She just kept running, her mind a blur, thoughts scattered like a million pieces of glass. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, eerie shadows along the deserted road. Her breath came in ragged bursts, her chest tightening with each step. The city felt wrong, empty. Phyllis's pulse raced. Her thoughts scrambled. Where is she even going? She had no plan, no destination, just the need to escape. But the fear, the sense of being hunted, it wouldn't leave. The sound of footsteps behind her snapped her back to reality. Someone was following. She could hear them. Footsteps, light but quick, gaining on her. Her manager grabbed her arm, yanking her back into an alley. "We need to hide," he panted, his grip tight on her. She turned to him, her eyes wide with desperation. "Who's behind us?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes darted around nervously, scanning the alley. "They're coming. I don't know what they want, but they're coming." Phyllis looked over her shoulder. Nothing. No one. But the tension in the air, it felt like the calm before the storm. The alley was narrow, the walls closing in on them as they moved further into the shadows. She tried to steady her breath, but every sound, every movement felt amplified. "Who were they?" Phyllis whispered, her voice shaky. "What do they want from me?" Her manager paused, his eyes avoiding hers. I don't know, Phyllis. Suddenly a distant, echoing voice broke through the silence. "Phyllis." Her blood turned to ice. It was her ex-husband's voice. Her manager grabbed her wrist, pulling her deeper into the alley. "We need to move. Now." They ran in the opposite direction, the sound of the voice following them, growing closer. "Phyllis, come back." She could hear his footsteps now, the unmistakable sound of him chasing them. Her manager yanked her around a corner, pushing her toward a dumpster. "Get in there. Now." Phyllis hesitated, her mind screaming at her to run, to keep going, but her body was drained, her limbs weak. The sound of the footsteps grew louder. She slipped behind the dumpster, barely squeezing herself into the small space. Her manager crouched beside her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They waited in the suffocating darkness, the air thick with the sound of their own heartbeat. Phyllis clutched her chest, her eyes darting between the dark alley and the entrance they had just passed. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was still, but then a low, chilling laugh echoed through the alley. It was her ex-husband. The woman's laugh followed, eerie and high-pitched. "Phyllis," he called again, his voice thick with malice. "I'm not done with you." The air grew colder, and Phyllis shuddered. She could feel the darkness pressing in from every side. "We can't stay here," her manager whispered urgently. But before they could move, the sound of the footsteps started again, closer, and then the unmistakable sound of the alleyway's metal gate rattled. Phyllis's heart skipped a beat. The gate. It was the only way out. Her manager glanced at her. "Get ready." They had nowhere else to go. The footsteps stopped right in front of the dumpster. The woman's voice, cold and sharp, cut through the silence. "You can run, Phyllis, but you can't hide." Phyllis's breath caught in her throat. Phyllis's pulse raced as the woman's voice echoed in the alley, the words slicing through the night air like a knife. "You can run, Phyllis, but you can't hide." The words were a dark promise. The sound of footsteps came closer, slower now, deliberate, as though they were savoring the moment. Phyllis squeezed her eyes shut, trying to steady her breathing. She could hear her manager's ragged breath beside her. His hand gripped hers tightly, knuckles white, but there was something frantic in his movements, something desperate. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, the dark alley closing in on them from all sides. The woman's voice, low and mocking, drifted through the darkness again. "We know you're here, Phyllis. We always find you." The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The words made her skin crawl. She wanted to scream, to move, but she couldn't. Her body felt paralyzed with fear, every muscle locked in place, frozen under the weight of what was coming. Her manager leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "Stay quiet. Stay still. Just for a moment. We can't let them know we're here." Phyllis nodded, but her mind screamed at her to do something, anything. The footsteps stopped. Her heart skipped a beat. Then a soft, almost imperceptible scrape of metal against stone. The gate. Someone was opening it. Phyllis's mind raced. The gate was their last chance to escape, to get out of the alley, to leave the nightmare behind. But what if it was a trap? Her manager tensed beside her, his grip tightening. "Ready," he whispered. Phyllis nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, the gate creaked open wider. A shadow emerged from the other side, tall and menacing. A figure stepped into the alley, silhouetted against the dim light of the street lamp at the far end. It was him, her ex-husband. Phyllis's stomach twisted with dread. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The woman's voice floated from behind him, distant but chilling. "He's only the beginning, Phyllis." Her ex-husband stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the spot where Phyllis and her manager were hiding. Phyllis's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking, like a predator stalking its prey. The seconds dragged on, each one stretching into an eternity. And then, without warning, he turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if he could sense them. Phyllis's breath caught in her throat. She thought they had been unnoticed, but the feeling of being hunted was too real. "Phyllis," he called, his voice barely a whisper in the wind. "It's over." Phyllis's pulse skipped. Her manager's grip on her arm tightened, and she felt the tremor in his hand. "We have to run," he whispered urgently, his voice strained. But Phyllis couldn't move. Her mind screamed at her, but her body was frozen, caught in the nightmare unfolding before her. Then, without warning, the woman's shadow appeared beside her ex-husband, her presence like a dark cloud. "Come with us," the woman said, her voice a venomous whisper. "We're not done with you." Phyllis's chest tightened. Her ex-husband stepped forward again, slowly, his movements deliberate. But it wasn't him she was afraid of anymore. It was the woman whose cold, empty eyes never left Phyllis's face. A voice, so quiet it was almost lost in the stillness, cut through the air. "Run." Her manager yanked her up, pulling her toward the gate. They didn't have a second to lose. Phyllis moved instinctively, her legs trembling as she followed him, her mind too clouded with fear to think clearly. The gate was barely open enough to slip through, but they made it. They tumbled into the street beyond, breathless, hearts racing. Phyllis glanced behind her, just in time to see the figures emerging from the shadows, the woman and her ex-husband. They were following, closing in. The sound of their footsteps echoed louder in her ears. Her manager tugged her forward, toward the street, toward safety. But Phyllis knew. She knew this wouldn't end. Not until they had her. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could run. The street stretched ahead, but the darkness seemed to swallow it whole, pulling them further into the void with every step. Phyllis's legs felt like lead, but she couldn't stop running. Couldn't stop looking over her shoulder. Every step was a heartbeat, each one faster than the last. Her manager's grip on her arm never loosened, his breath ragged, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of escape. But it was too late for that. The figures in the alley were gaining on them. She could feel it. The woman's cold presence lingered in the air, her ex-husband's heavy footsteps following like a thunderstorm just behind them. Phyllis stumbled, her body betraying her, but her manager's hold tightened. "Keep going," he urged, his voice low and desperate. They reached the end of the street, a dead end. Phyllis's heart dropped into her stomach. They were trapped. "Where do we go?" she gasped, panic flooding her chest. But her manager didn't answer. His eyes scanned wildly, as though searching for something, anything, that could save them. Her ex-husband's voice cut through the night like a blade. "There's nowhere left to run, Phyllis." She turned sharply, her heart pounding in her throat. He stood at the end of the street, the woman beside him, her face twisted in that same cold, emotionless smile. They were cornered. Phyllis felt the weight of their presence pressing in on her, suffocating her. There was no escape. "We've been waiting," the woman's voice echoed, "for you to come back." Phyllis took a step back, her breath shallow. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, the words escaping in a strangled sob. Her ex-husband smiled again, a dark, hollow grin. "You've always belonged to us, Phyllis," he said softly, his voice low and chilling. "And now, you'll come home." The sound of the woman's laugh chilled her to the bone. Her manager's hand shot out, pulling her behind him. "Stay behind me," he hissed, his voice trembling. Phyllis wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything, but she couldn't. Her body was frozen in fear. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The air felt thick, suffocating. The woman's gaze never wavered, her eyes locked on Phyllis, piercing through the darkness with terrifying intensity. "We've waited too long," the woman said. "It's time to finish this." Phyllis's mind was racing, her thoughts scattered. But then she saw it. At the far end of the street, barely visible in the shadows, a car. A car she didn't recognize. The headlights flickered on, blinding in the dark. Phyllis blinked, her heart racing. And then, before she could process it, the car sped toward them, tires screeching. Her ex-husband and the woman barely had time to react before the car swerved around them. Phyllis's manager shoved her hard, knocking her off balance as the car screeched to a halt just inches from them. A door flew open. "Get in," a voice shouted. Phyllis's head spun. She didn't know who it was, but the car was their only chance. Without thinking, she grabbed her manager's hand and they ran. They barely made it inside before the car sped off, engine roaring, the world blurring around them. Phyllis looked back one last time. Her ex-husband and the woman stood still in the street, watching them leave. And in that moment, Phyllis knew it wasn't over. The nightmare had just begun. The car raced through the night, the engine growling beneath them as the streets blurred into a streak of neon lights and shadows. Phyllis's heart pounded, her breath still shallow, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She could barely focus. Her mind kept replaying the chilling sight of her ex-husband and the woman, standing there unmoving, as they sped away. Her manager sat beside her, tense, his face pale under the dim glow of the dashboard light. Who was that?" Phyllis whispered, her voice trembling. The driver didn't answer right away. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low, almost haunted. "But they're not going to stop. Not until they have you." Phyllis shuddered, her hands gripping the seat, her pulse erratic. Why me?" He glanced at her quickly, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, then back to the road. "I wish I had an answer for you." Phyllis's mind spun, fragments of memories colliding in a storm of confusion. Her ex-husband's face, his voice, the woman, the endless sense of dread that clung to her. But the fear, the fear was suffocating. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The driver didn't respond right away, his eyes narrowing as he made a sharp turn. Somewhere safe. The car swerved through another dark street, the world outside a blur of shadows and light. Phyllis leaned forward, peering out the window. Her thoughts were too jumbled to process the world around her. Her ex-husband's voice, echoing in her mind, kept coming back. "You belong to us." Phyllis clenched her fists. No, she couldn't belong to them. She wouldn't let them take her back into that dark place. The car suddenly screeched to a halt. Phyllis lurched forward, her breath catching in her throat. "Stay down," the driver hissed, his hand reaching back to push her down against the seat. Phyllis barely had time to react. The headlights of another car appeared, cutting through the night like a knife. The driver didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stared ahead, his face hard as stone. The other car slowed, then stopped right beside them. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound but the hum of the engine. Then the passenger door opened. A tall figure stepped out, moving swiftly, almost silently. Phyllis's heart skipped. It was a man, tall, dressed in black, his face obscured by shadows. But there was something about his posture, the way he moved, controlled, methodical, that made her skin crawl. The driver didn't flinch. "Get in," the man said, his voice calm, almost too calm. Phyllis's stomach twisted. She didn't trust him. The man's eyes flicked toward the back seat, his gaze landing on her for a brief moment, and she could feel the coldness in his stare. "Not much time," he said, his words clipped, purposeful. "We need to go. Now." Phyllis looked at her manager. His face was drawn, tired. He was silent, staring at the man and then at her. "Do we trust him?" she whispered. He didn't answer, but his eyes flickered toward the road ahead, toward the distant dark horizon. Finally, the man spoke again. "You don't have a choice." Phyllis didn't hesitate. She had no choice, no time. She shoved open the car door and climbed out, her legs shaky, but driven by instinct. The man stepped aside as she passed, the cold air biting at her skin. Her manager followed closely behind. The man moved swiftly, opening the back door of the second car. It was sleek, dark, and ominous, its interior dimly lit by a small lamp. Phyllis slid into the back seat. The door slammed shut behind her. The engine roared to life, and they were off again, tearing through the night. For the first time in hours, Phyllis allowed herself to close her eyes. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched, that the nightmare hadn't left. It was only waiting for the right moment to strike. The car sped faster, weaving through darkened streets. Phyllis felt her mind reel, but then the man in the front seat spoke. "We're going to make a stop. You need to understand something." Phyllis straightened, her stomach twisting. "What?" The man glanced back briefly. "They won't stop. Not until you understand what they want from you." Her heart dropped. "They'll come for you," he continued, his voice even controlled. "And when they do, you'll have to be ready." "Ready? Ready for what?" She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. And then she understood. She wasn't running from them. She was running toward something far worse. Phyllis's chest tightened as the weight of his words sank in. Running toward something far worse. What could possibly be worse than the nightmare she had just escaped? Her mind raced, but the fog of fear and exhaustion clouded her thoughts. The car hummed along, the tires slicing through the empty night as the city passed by in a blur. Her ex-husband's voice echoed again in her mind, his words haunting her. Asterisk, you belong to us. Asterisk. Her grip on the seat tightened. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man in the front seat didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his fingers drumming rhythmically on the steering wheel. "To a safe house," he finally answered. "But you need to listen. When we get there, you can't trust anyone. Not even me." Phyllis's stomach churned. "Why? What are you talking about?" The man's voice was low, almost detached, as he answered. "Your ex-husband and his partner aren't just after you. They want something that has always been in your blood." Her heart stopped. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What are they after?" His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching her gaze briefly. "That's something I can't explain yet. Not until you understand what you really are." Phyllis felt her pulse race, her breath catching in her throat. "What?" "I don't understand." He exhaled sharply, a tense silence hanging in the air. "You think this is all just about a woman and her creepy husband chasing you? It's bigger than that," he said. "You've been running from them for years. But the truth is, They've been hunting you for something else entirely." Phyllis's mind swirled. She couldn't make sense of his words. She'd never been anything special, just an artist, an underappreciated one. She thought back to her career, the late nights in the studio, the desperate calls from her ex-husband demanding money, the strange and unsettling encounters with mysterious figures in her past. But nothing had prepared her for this. The car sped down the road, the headlights piercing the night. But it felt as if everything inside the vehicle had gone still, silent, like the air was suffocating, wrapping around them tighter with each passing second. The man turned the car sharply onto an even darker, quieter street, the lights dimming further as they drove deeper into an unknown part of the city. Her pulse quickened again. She felt the weight of the moment pressing in on her. Something was happening, something terrible, and she was right in the middle of it. "Where are we?" Phyllis asked, her voice barely above a breath. The man didn't answer, his eyes fixed ahead as the car slowed to a crawl, and then they stopped. The engine turned off. Silence. Phyllis could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, her breath shallow and uneven. "Get out," the man said abruptly, his voice cold now, devoid of the faint kindness it had held earlier. Phyllis glanced at her manager, who had been quiet this whole time. His face was pale, his eyes full of fear. But there was something else there, something unspoken. The door opened, and Phyllis hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. The chill of the night air hit her instantly, making her skin prick with cold. The building in front of them was dark and foreboding, an old, weathered structure that seemed out of place against the sleek, modern city behind it. It loomed over them like a forgotten relic of another time, its broken windows and rusted iron gates making it seem more like a prison than a safe house. Phyllis's stomach twisted. The man stepped out behind her, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. She turned to face him. "What's in there?" "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But remember, no matter what you see, don't trust anyone. Not even me." Phyllis's breath caught in her throat. What was happening? What was so dangerous about this place? Her manager grabbed her arm, pulling her gently toward the entrance. "Stay close to me. Don't talk to anyone." Her mind raced with questions, but all she could do was nod. The door creaked open with a long, eerie groan. They stepped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. Phyllis could barely make out the outline of the walls, the shadows pressing in on all sides. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something older, something ancient. And then, as the door slammed shut behind them, Phyllis heard it. A low, deep hum, coming from somewhere far in the distance. It was like a vibration through the very ground beneath her feet. Her heart skipped, the fear coursing through her veins again. "Stay quiet," the man whispered, his breath warm against her ear. And in the silence that followed, Phyllis realized that there was no turning back, no escape. Not anymore. Phyllis's breath was shallow as she stood in the darkened hallway of the old building, the walls surrounding her like a suffocating embrace. Her manager's hand gripped her arm, pulling her forward. But she was frozen, the dread settling deeper into her bones with every step they took. The hum she had heard earlier now vibrated through the floor beneath her feet. It seemed to come from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the very air itself. It was low and steady, like the heartbeat of something ancient, something alive. They reached the end of the hallway, and the man in front of them motioned toward a large, iron door. It stood ajar, its hinges creaking as it swayed slightly, as if it had been waiting for them. Phyllis's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't make herself move. The man glanced back, his eyes hard, unreadable. "It's time. You need to know the truth now." Phyllis felt her throat tighten, the words she had been holding back pushing to the surface. "What is it? What do they want from me?" His expression softened for just a moment, and Phyllis caught a glimpse of the pain in his eyes. "They want the power inside you." Phyllis's stomach twisted. The power inside her? She didn't understand. "Ever since you were born, you've been marked," he continued, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Your bloodline has something they've been hunting for generations. And now that you've reached the point where you can unlock it," he hesitated, his voice growing dark, "they won't stop until they have it." Phyllis felt the world tilt around her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they didn't make any sense. She was just Phyllis Hyman, just a woman, an artist. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. The man stepped toward the door, his hand resting on the cold iron. "Are you ready to face it?" Before she could answer, the door swung open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. The vibration was stronger here, the hum now deafening in her ears. Phyllis's body froze as she stepped into the room. Figures stood in the shadows. Her ex-husband, the woman who had hunted her, and others. Familiar faces, faces she hadn't seen in years. They were waiting. Her ex-husband stepped forward, his cold eyes fixed on her. "It's over, Phyllis," he said, his voice low, full of finality. "You belong to us now." Phyllis took a step back, her heart racing. She knew there was no escape now. Not from them. Not from whatever was coming. The room was closing in on her. The power inside her, whatever it was pulsing, calling to them. She could feel it, deep within her bones. And as the door slammed shut behind her, she realized that this was the moment she had been running from her entire life. There was no turning back now. The room felt suffocating as Phyllis stood frozen in the center, the darkness around her pressing in like a vice. The figures in the shadows seemed to loom larger with every passing second. Her ex-husband's cold, unfeeling eyes never left her, the woman standing by his side, just as motionless. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding, trying to make sense of the impossible. The hum in the air intensified, vibrating through her chest, rattling her bones. It felt as though the room itself was alive, responding to something deeper, something inside her. She turned her gaze toward the man who had brought her here. His face was still unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, an apology, a regret. "Phyllis, he began, but the words seemed to die in his throat. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. She wasn't just an artist. She wasn't just a woman running from her past. She had always known there was something different about her, something no one had ever told her, something buried deep, hidden for so long. Now, the truth was undeniable. Her ex-husband took a step forward, his voice low and chilling. "It's too late, Phyllis. You've always known what you were capable of, and now we will finally have it." The power inside her stirred again, a force awakening in the very core of her being. She could feel it, the energy, the weight of it. It was hers. It had always been hers. But it wasn't just about them anymore. The woman beside him stepped forward as well, her eyes full of something Phyllis couldn't quite place. Fear? Reverence? Phyllis swallowed, her voice trembling but firm. "You can't have it." The words hung in the air, suspended, and for a long moment, everything stood still. The hum, the darkness, the figures. And then, with a deep, ragged breath, Phyllis stepped into the light. The power inside her surged, radiating outward, filling the room. She didn't know how she did it, only that she couldn't let them take it. Not now. Not ever. As the room began to pulse with energy, her ex-husband's expression shifted. Fear, disbelief, and finally rage. But it was too late. Phyllis was no longer running. She wasn't just surviving. She was reclaiming what was always hers. The hum faded, the air clearing, and as the last of the figures vanished into the shadows, Phyllis stood alone in the room, free. And for the first time in her life, she understood. This was her power. This was her legacy. and no one would ever take it from her again. The silence stretched on, but Phyllis knew this was the beginning of something new. Her journey had come full circle.